Work session agenda, call to order. We are called to order. There will be no further ceremony, and we'll start with a presentation by Utility Finance Solutions on cost of service study. Bill Zondak.
Before I introduce Mark, just to give you a little background on our rate studies, because some of you were not here in the beginning. We first entered into an agreement with Jerry McKinsey of MGT in September of 2011, and we had our first work session in July of 2012. And since then, we've had numerous emails and discussions with the commission during that period of time. And finally, last fall, in November, it was decided to go with a cost of service study. And we went out for RFQ, and what the result of that is we entered into a contract with UFS in February of this year. And this is the preliminary result of that study, and I'd like to introduce Mark Beauchamp of United Utility Financial Services. He'll make the presentation tonight.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to try putting this here to see. Hopefully it'll still work.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work?
No.
Thought I had a good idea. What I'm here to talk about is the results of the electric cost of service. Now, a cost of service study consists of basically three components. And what you're seeing tonight is the first two. The first thing we do is a long-term financial projection. Now, the financial projection that we did, we actually ran three different scenarios that you're going to see. And it has to do with the construction of the new generating units. We ran scenarios in the financial projection with respect to how the rates would change if you constructed the new generating unit, and the capacity payments increased to about $6 million, 6.2 I think it was. A second scenario where you did not improve the generating units, but you were able to keep the $3 million of capacity payments. And then a third scenario where you did not make the capital improvements, but you lost the capacity payments. All right? So we ran those three scenarios. Now, the second part of the study is the cost of service study. Now, the cost of service study identifies how much it costs to provide service to each class of customers. And it also identifies things like what that monthly customer charge should be for like a residential, and what the demand charge should be or the energy charge. And the third component is the rate design. Now, that has not been done, because what I'm looking for before we start that phase of the study is to discuss these results with the commission to get your feedback on, one, the recommended rate track or rate adjustments. Also, how much leeway you'll allow me to move some of the classes closer to cost of service. Because you're going to see some variation between what the increases should be in one class over another class. All right? And obviously, you don't want to create rate shock. Any changes you probably want to do in a very slow, systematic fashion, so customers don't see a large spike in their rates. All right, that's the second thing, kind of input I'm looking for. The third thing is what to do with the monthly customer charge. I'm going to get into a lot of detail about that, what that monthly customer charge represents and what it recovers, and the importance of trying to get that to the cost of service-based levels. You have a very low monthly customer charge for your residential. It's not the lowest I've ever seen, but it's definitely one of the lowest. And the cost of service study shows it should be substantially higher. But again, you don't want to go from where you are to what the cost of service study says, because it would cause rate shock in a sense. I mean, rates would increase for some and decrease for others. And so it's best to do it in a very slow, systematic fashion. Those are the three main things I'm looking for before I start the rate design process. Just some other observations about your current rates. you have a lot of tiers, especially in the general service categories. And those tiers are not cost justified. It's one of those things, I think they were established a lot of years ago, and they've never been really revisited. And rate structures like that are very difficult for customers to understand. You know, when it comes to electric rates, you want customers to be able to understand those rates and how their bills are calculated so that they can respond to that price signal that we're trying to send. Because we're trying to send a price signal for conservation, to have them not use energy at certain times of the day, whatever we're trying to accomplish. And the rates have to be as understandable. All right, and you have 5 block tiers in many of your rate classes, and those rate blocks are not cost justified, and they're very difficult to understand. So I would like to simplify it, but again, it's one of those things that if you agree with me, to try simplifying those rates, we're not going to be able to do it in 1 year. It's going to be something that's going to take multiple rate adjustments over a number of years. Otherwise, it's going to cause big winners and big losers, and I don't think you'd want to do that. So, but what I want to talk about directly is I want to review the financial projections and the targets. That's actually at the back part of the presentation. But I want to discuss how we look and how we assess the financial health or condition of a utility, be it an electric utility, water, wastewater, telecommunications, gas, how we look and assess the financial health of the utility. And I will say this, your utility is financially healthy. And the thing, what we're looking at is trying to keep you that way. And that's really what it boils down to. We want to keep you financially healthy. And there's 3 main things, I'm going to get into detail on these, but that we look at to assess the financial health. The first one is debt coverage ratio. When you issue debt, you have to maintain, when you have bond ordinances, and you have to maintain what's called a debt coverage ratio that's in that bond covenant. So we look at that and we try to make sure that you're going to stay above that, because we don't want you to go into technical default on that debt, especially in a situation where you have a possibility where you may have to issue substantial amounts of debt. We want to make sure you get as good of a bond rating as possible to help keep the rates as low as possible for your customers. The second thing we look at is cash reserves. I'm often asked to identify the targeted level of cash that a utility should have. And it's really difficult sometimes for consultants to say this. I can't tell you. What I can tell you is how much cash you should have at a minimum. So you have cash in reserve to pay your bills. If a catastrophic event occurs, that you have money to ensure reliable service to your customers. That I can tell you. I'm going to go through our calculation of how we determine that. The third item is something that you're probably not very familiar with. And I'm going to get into this. There's a lot of slides in leading up to this discussion about target operating income. Target operating income is what's called an accrual basis. You know, when you do books, you have depreciation expense, revenues, expenses that include depreciation. You have operating income, and this is it's called a utility basis. And what we do is we identify what the utility should have for a target operating income. Now, first when you hear income, you think to yourself, we're a non-for-profit utility. All right. Why do we have to have a rate of return or net income? But we're not talking about a rate of return to make money. We're talking about a rate of return to cover 2 things. One is interest expense on debt, and the other one is the inflationary increase in the asset's replacement cost that I'll get into. Because when a customer uses an asset and they're consuming that asset, well, easier way to explain it, let's say you have $1 million investment and with a 20-year life. And say you charge depreciation expense in your rates. At the end of 20 years, you theoretically have $1 million to replace that asset. But it's not going to cost you $1 million to replace it. It's going to cost you more. Because every year the replacement cost of that asset goes up. So what we identify is what I call the break-even rate of return. And that determines what that target operating income should be. And I'll get into that. It's quite low. I think it's about less than 4% here, but rate of return. Then I want to talk about the cost of service results. How much it costs to provide service to each class. And I want to get into detail about the monthly customer charge to get input and feedback from the commission on what to do with the customer charge. And then again, like I said, the guidance on the rate design. How much leeway, if you do agree with my rate track, how much leeway you'll allow me to move some of the classes closer to cost of service. And I'll get into more detail on that. The first thing I want to talk about, the first section, is the determination of revenue requirements. Now, revenue requirements is how much money the utility should recover in the rates that they're charging to customers. Now, there's two ways to determine this, all right? And historically, Coffeyville has used what's called a cash basis, all right? Where you took the O&M expense, you added to that debt service, and then you added some sort of capital improvements or normalized capital improvements. When you added all that up, that became your revenue requirements. Now, the cash basis can lead to certain issues that I'll get into. We look at it, in a sense, both ways. We look at it on a cash flow basis, but we also look at it on this utility basis. Now, the utility basis also includes O&M expense. It's not the same, it's close. That's where the similarity stops between the cash basis and the utility basis. We then add depreciation expense. We include depreciation expense. And the reason we do that is when you have an asset that you put in service, brand new asset, when you first start using that asset, you're not spending a lot of money to repair and replace it. But every year the customers are using that asset and consuming it and wearing it down. So depreciation expense is a representation of the value that they're taking out of that asset. If you don't include depreciation expense in your rates, what happens oftentimes is you're saying, we're going to let the next generation, in a sense, pay for that asset. And that's what gets utilities in trouble that use the cash basis. Because one of two things happen. Either they're not charging the appropriate rates, leaving it for the next generation, or the capital improvement program maybe is high that year, or in those years, and those capital improvements have long-term lives, but yet they're charging them to the current customer, so they're overcharging them. So the utility basis tries to, in a sense, make it fair and prevent those generational subsidies from occurring. Now, the third item is the rate of return that I talked about. Yes?
Depreciation, I'm kicking around my head, I'm assuming it's going to be straight line.
It's straight line.
Okay, thank you.
The rate of return, it has the two components. The first one is interest expense. We have to set the operating income high enough to be able to fund or pay for your interest expense and your debt. And then the inflationary increase in the assets replacement cost. Now, what this normally does for, you're actually lower than most utilities on this, what's called rate of return. But most public power systems, when you do this calculation, the rate of return for the electric utilities between 5.5% and 6%. I think you're a little over 4%. But that's the break-even rate of return. Now, if you were an investor-owned utility, your rate of return that would be approved by the Public Service Commission would be anywhere from 10 to 11%. But that's misleading because that's after federal income tax. That's considered an expense. So they actually have to generate rates of return that are 15, 16% in order to get 10 or 11. Now we're talking about a break-even rate of return to cover interest expense on debt and to cover inflation. That typically equates between 5.5% and 6%. Like I said, I think you were around 4.2. I have a slide that shows that.
So on the inflationary increase, saying over the long haul, that's a typical number. I mean, you know, to look out 5 years would require a pretty good crystal ball.
The rate of return? Actually, we do. We have it out 5 years. It varies, and the reason that yours is a little lower than normal, I just remembered why. It's because we have in your projection the capital improvements at the power plant and the subsequent issuance of debt. And when that happens, because the calculation is what's called a weighted average cost of capital, which uses interest and uses inflation, and it depends what proportion is in debt. When you issue a significant amount of debt, it drives the rate of return down. You know, it sounds kind of unusual. The operating income actually goes up because your asset values go up.
Probably jumping ahead, but what was that cost of capital?
The cost of capital, what we do is,
What is
I
it?
don't remember what we used. Was it 4.5
4.5, 5?
or
I
5?
thought it was less than that, Stephanie. Would you have that?
I can look. I have it in my program. I'll tell you what. Let me open it up. If you
No, that's
think
okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
When we get there.
Yeah, I apologize because I don't think it's in here.
Okay.
I don't show it. I'll open up
That was
my
just more of a
computer.
curiosity. Thank you.
No,
Go ahead.
Okay. So now the cash basis has certain advantages and disadvantages to it. The main advantage of the cash basis, it tends to be understood by the public, by city councils, commissions. It's traditionally how the general fund of the city operates, all right, is on a cash basis. Usually it matches up with the budget process of the city. The disadvantage is it tends to conceal major rate problems and revenue deficiencies. And what happens oftentimes for utilities that use the cash basis, and you see this really pronounced in water and wastewater, where they go along setting rates on a cash basis, and then all of a sudden a major capital improvement occurs to replace existing infrastructure.
You don't have the money.
And yes, you don't have the money, so rates end up skyrocketing, 20, 30, 40% increases. And that occurs because the rates have not historically been set properly. All right. Now, it's actually oftentimes happens to electric utilities. It's just partially disguised through that because you have the power cost adjustment, which recovers 75% of your cost. But a lot of times it's still happening with electric. It's just, like I said, it's disguised. So, so of course it tends to result in large, unexpected, in a sense, rate adjustments. And it's, believe it or not, it's not generally accepted in courts if the rates are ever challenged, the cash basis. And the reason is because they're subjective. The determination of revenue requirements is very subjective and very unstable. So courts typically, and public service commissions, courts, the general industry standards are to use the utility basis, depreciation expense, and rate of return. Now, one of the main advantages of the utility basis is that when the rates, when they occur, you tend to have smaller, more frequent rate adjustments is what occurs. And as a general rule of thumb, especially with electric, if you can keep your rate adjustments less than 5%, you get very little backlash from the community. Increases between 5 and 10%, they still tend to be acceptable, but you get backlash from the large users. All right, it messes up their budgets and you get some complaints. But we always try to avoid our double-digit rate increases. So what the utility basis does is identifies the need for those smaller increases. And what you're going to see, and I'm kind of jumping way ahead, is a rate adjustment or rate tracks that we're recommending for Coffeyville, and that's with the inclusion of the generating station, a 1.77% increase a year.
For how
So
many years?
relatively modest. What's that?
For how many
For
years?
5 years.
Okay.
So, now, what we do is sometimes, and this is kind of what's happening here to some degree, is when you first do the study on the utility basis, you see the need for large rate adjustments. And yours is going to show like a 12% actually, what it would show. But because we do a long-term financial plan and we look at those other targets, which are cash basis targets, we develop a plan to phase in to the utility basis over time. All right. So what we did here, basically it's 4 years. You're at the utility basis targets in 4 years. Now, to get into some of the factors that we look at to assess your health of the utility, with the debt coverage ratio, as I talked about, cash reserves, and target operating income. Now, when you look at the bond covenants, most revenue bonds, most utilities like electric utilities will issue revenue bonds. And the revenue bonds come with bond covenants. And most often, or most common, is about a 1.2 coverage, all right, where you have to generate 20% more in cash than what it costs you to operate the system, all right. So what we do is, if we were to set your rates to meet that 1.2 coverage, about half the time you'd actually fail coverage. Because electric sales are so dependent on weather and unexpected events occurring. So we build in a safety factor. Usually it's a 0.2 safety factor. So we target a minimum coverage ratio of 1.4. And one of the things, that we're kind of close on in the first year after we issue debt, we're real close to that 1.4 you'll see in the coverage ratio. But we want to make sure that you don't violate those bond covenants. Because if you do, you're in technical default on that debt. Not necessarily that somebody's going to come knocking on your door demanding payment, but the next time you go to issue debt, it will show up. And the other thing is, we want to make sure you're as financially stable prior to even issuing the debt for the generating units. Because the higher bond rating you can get, the lower your interest rate. And then there's the cash reserve policy. Now, we specify or identify the minimum level of cash the utility should maintain. And to determine that, we look at a number of different factors. One of them is called the working capital lag difference. It's the timing difference between when you pay bills and get your money from customers. For example, you may go all through the month of January paying wages, supplies, bills, and for simplicity, let's say I have one billing cycle. At the end of the month, you read your meters and you send the bills out the first week of February. You get the money from your customers the first week of March. So there's a lag time difference between when you paid it and you get that money back. And you have to make sure you have the money in your reserves. The industry standard almost everywhere, it can vary slightly, but it's almost always 45 days on your operating expenses. Power supply is a little different. The working capital lag is actually greatly reduced because you don't have quite the timing difference. It's usually like 5 or 10 day working capital there. But then we also look at your exposure to certain risk factors, such as a catastrophic event. We don't necessarily want to make sure that you have enough money in reserves to fund a catastrophic event. What we want to do is to make sure you have enough money in reserves that if one occurred, that you have enough money to start the repair and replacement process to maintain reliable service to your customers until adequate financing can be arranged. All right?
So how many days cash do we have now?
Days cash, I'm not sure. I'd have to look at that. I can calculate quickly mentally once I get to it.
Fund balance policy requires 3 months, and that's pretty close to where we're running.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think our numbers were close to yours, but actually a little less. than yours, that's right. As I mentioned earlier, what we identify as the minimum amount of cash, that you need to be above that level. All right. And the reason I said earlier that I cannot tell you the target level of cash is because if you're funding your system properly, and funding depreciation expense and inflation, your cash reserves are going to fluctuate naturally over time depending on the age of your infrastructure. You know, because, for example, if you have relatively new infrastructure, your capital improvement program is probably smaller. But during that time, you should be building your cash reserves. As your infrastructure ages, now you're going to be spending down on those reserves. All right. So that's why I say I can't tell you the target number. I can only identify the minimum. This is just a listing of the certain factors that affect the amount of cash the utility should have. You know, some of the things that we look at, like your exposure to certain risk, you have a power cost adjustment, which is very good. That minimizes risk and helps lower the amount of cash that you need. One of the things I do want to talk to you about, and I forgot to mention this earlier, is your power cost adjustment. You have one that has the lowest amount of risk for the utility, and that's a good thing, but it's probably has the most amount of volatility for your customers.
Yep.
And because what it does is it basically looks at a month's worth of power supply, and then 2 months later, basically, it adjusts it, the power cost adjustment to recover. So what happens is your power cost adjustment does this. And one of the things I was hoping to do, if you agree with me, is to move to what's called a 12-month rolling average.
So it gets rid of the peaks and the valleys,
gets
and
rid
it
of-
levels it out quite a bit.
Exactly. Now, the downside of it, what happens then is instead of, right now, we're shifting all the risk to the customer. When we do a 12-month rolling average, the utility is bearing some of the risk. You know, because if power costs go up, it may take a full 12 months for a PCA to reach that level. But you're financially stable, you have adequate cash reserves, and I think that's something that we can do for our customers here is to smooth that out. I don't know if you've gotten complaints from it, but I would think, yeah.
And so ultimately, the PCA would probably be a slightly higher percentage, so that we limited the risk for the utility financially in the event that the electric rates or the cost went up substantially. But the benefit to the customer would be that they wouldn't have the giant spikes like
Yeah.
in the warmer months. Is that kind of
Yeah,
how it would work?
Exactly. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you had a power cost adjustment of a penny
Yeah.
under your current method, but then when you go to recalculate it, say it was 2 cents because your power supply cost went up. All right, now on a 12-month rolling average, what would happen is it's currently a penny, but it's going to take that next month's power cost, and it's going to look not just at that 1 month, but what's occurred over the past year. So instead of going from 1 to 2, it's going to go from, say, 1 to 1.1 cents, and then the next month to 1.2 cents, and 1.3, and so on. So it's going to gradually move up rather than jump up.
Okay.
But like I said, as a utility, we're taking on more risk when we do that.
I like that.
Very too.
Now, this is actually your calculation of minimum cash. We look at these 5 factors, okay, which is kind of standard. Sometimes we add more, sometimes we remove. But we look at your O&M expense less depreciation, and 12.3% is our 45-day working capital leg. Your purchase power cost, we also look at. We look at your working capital leg. We also look at the peaks of the year, because your O&M costs are relatively flat, but your power supply costs go up and down. So we look at the peak power supply cost and the working capital leg, And so in your situation, we took about 10% of the annual purchase power cost projection. We look at your historical investment in assets to try to at least quantify or recognize that that your exposure to a catastrophic event. Now, because we're the generating unit, what we do is we look at the age of the infrastructure. And if you look nationwide, the average public power system is about 50% depreciated. The majority of them fall between 47 and 53% depreciated. Now, because our projection is including the generating unit, your average infrastructure cost is actually below average, all right, substantially below. So we use 1% of your historical investment. If you were an average utility, we would increase that to 2%. And if you were a utility that was over 55% depreciated, we'd use 3%. So we're trying to recognize that the age of the infrastructure, if it's an older system, you have more exposure to something like an ice storm, a windstorm, a hurricane, whatever. Then we look at your debt service payment. Debt service payment is made twice a year. The first one typically includes principal and interest, and one includes interest only. And we look at what your largest debt service payment is during the year, and we use that percentage. So, in other words, in one payment, you make 80% of your annual debt service payment in one payment for debt service. Then we look at your capital improvement program. We want to make sure that you have enough money available to fund your capital improvement program, less your debt, your bond proceeds. And to try to smooth that out, we use your 5-year average. Okay. So what this came up with is about 9.3 million, actually goes up to almost 11 million in 2019. You kind of have to exclude this year because we put the bond proceeds in this year. But your cash reserves are projected at around 15.5 million, going up to 17. This actually has that 1.7% increase in it. Now the rate of return target, let's see, I talked about this. You can see it actually calculated about 3.6% is your rate of return, which is actually one of the lowest I've ever calculated. And the reason for that is because of your the age of your current infrastructure in conjunction with the issuance of the debt. Because what happens is, let me give you an example of a utility I worked on a couple of months ago. This was really unusual. But the infrastructure age, it was about 75, 80% depreciated. Remember I said the average is 50%? Mm-hmm. When we look at inflation, if you go from 1991 to 2013, the average increase in replacement costs of electric infrastructure was 3.1%. So because of the way this calculation works, we want that 3% based on the total historical investment to be set aside. But the way the calculation works, it uses what's called net book value, which is an accounting concept, all right? Because you look at after depreciation. Well, for this utility that was 80% depreciated, I had to take the 3.1% and increase it, basically divided by 0.2, so that number had to be up around 8-9%, all right? But in your situation, because your infrastructure, especially with the addition of the generating unit, is so new, that 3.1% was only increased slightly because the plant, the difference between total historical investment and net book value was real close. Does that make sense? Right? Because remember, I'm only trying to recover inflation. But this is an accounting concept, and it's based on net book value. So the reason I do it this way, and I don't just go and take historical investment and multiply by 3.1, is because the industry doesn't do it that way. And if anybody ever picks up my cost of service study, I want like a public service commissioner or whatever to be able to understand how that was determined, because that's a key component. So I want to say it's an industry standard calculation. All right. but I have to make those adjustments in order to get back at that inflation number. Hope that kind of makes some sense. Now I want to talk about the three scenarios, and this is kind of where we're getting into the one scenario that we based everything on is scenario 1. But for informational purposes, we wanted to make sure that you're aware of what would happen if you did not issue debt and you had about $3 million. You were able to maintain the $3 million in capacity payments for your power provider. And scenario 3 was a situation where you did not reinvest in the generating unit, but you lost the capacity payments. And there's a high probability, because the age of your generating units, eventually you will lose those.
Yep.
And that $3 million is fairly significant. You'll see that. Before I get into those, though, this is the cost of service results. And this shows how much it costs to provide service to each class of customers. And this shows how much projected revenue we are to receive from each customer class. So if you look at like the system average, the cost of service study says we should charge rates to recover $21.4 million. We're not recommending this. I don't want to alarm you with this percent. We should charge rates to recover $21.4 million, but we're only recovering 19.2, which means that we would need 11.8% increase to hit that target operating income. Now, if we look at like residential, the residential urban rate, cost of service 5.2, about 4.8 projected revenue, 9% is what it shows. It's actually less than the average, which means that any rate adjustments that we do, the residential classes should get a little bit less than the average increase. Right? The rural showed the need for a 7% increase. Right? Then you get into certain things like area lighting. This KCC residential rural is actually something that we just can't arbitrarily, we can't increase. We have quite the control. It goes through the Public Service Commission. So it looks like that has not been adjusted in a number of years. It's a small rate class, but it is something that over time we should try to correct. Let's see. Again, this is almost such a small class. But when you look at this, most of your major classes are relatively close to this average. Now, there's some of your major classes that jump out. The general large off-peak rate shows the need for a 17% increase. I mean, you look at the large power, actually shows a slight decrease. This rate is definitely heavily discounted.
So who is that? Are those industries? Is that what that is? General large off-peak?
Oh, is there 2 or 3? How many industries are in there?
There's 4 or 5 on that.
Oh.
The big power users.
Now, one of the things, and one of the pieces of direction I'm looking for is whatever rate adjustments that you allow me to do, the next thing is how much leeway around that to move closer to cost of service. Let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say you say a 2% rate increase. Then you also give me a plus or minus 2% leeway. And that would mean that no customer class would see an increase greater than 4%. But all customers would see 0 or above. And I'd work within that range to move closer to cost of service to try to avoid any rate shock, in a sense, on customers. The easiest way to put it.
Question.
Yes.
On that 17% line, did your projections include, I'm assuming that you were looking at historical information. So the question then is, does that projection include the reduction in cost of service and loss of revenues as a result of Southwire and Amazon leaving the area?
It is. That was removed.
So those are factored
Those are
out.
factored out, yeah.
So with
That was
those-
one of the, yeah, because I think we had them in initially.
We
We
had
had to
them in
remove
to
them.
start with, and once the announcement was made, we contacted them and had
Okay,
them
so
pull
this
those
has
out.
been taken out of that line.
That's why we're an additional 3 weeks out. We were planning on having this about 3
Okay.
weeks ago.
Thank you.
This slide, I really want to go to the rate comparison slide, and then the monthly customer charges. One of the things, this is, it's just an easy way to get a quick assessment of your rates. It's not a detailed survey. It's using what's called they're called EIA 12 forms that all utilities are required to file with the Energy Administration, U.S. And what it does is it shows the average cost per kilowatt hour for every utility in the country. And this line right here, purple, my wife says I'm colorblind, but I think that's purple. This is Coffeyville's rate. So like for residential, your average rate is just a little slightly less than 10. This is in 2012. The green line are co-ops, and of course they're up here. Now co-ops, you expect them to be higher because of the density of the service territory. They're traditionally more expensive than public power systems. Now Kansas investor-owned utilities are this red line, and you can see there's quite a difference between Coffeyville's average rates and the investor-owned utilities. This blue line are the other public power systems in Kansas. So you can see you have lower than average rates within the state, quite a bit lower, for residential and industrial. Now for commercial, I mean, you're about on par. A lot of this has to do with your residential rate structure. There's a lot of things that can go into it. One is how different utilities classify commercial is a big one. Also, you have certain weaknesses in your rate structure itself that we would like to try to correct. And a lot of that has to do with those 5 blocks that you have in your rate structure. I'd like to try to simplify those over time. But again, not in a manner that's going to cause anybody heartburn, but in a very slow manner. Now the monthly customer charge, I'm going to come back to these slides, but when you look at your current monthly customer charge, it's $4.59. The cost of service, this is for residential, says it should be upwards of $18. All right. Now, I want to talk about what makes up that number. When a customer has a meter installed in their facility or their home, as a utility, you had the cost to install the meter, to repair the meter, to replace the meter, to read the meter, to build the meter, and the cost of the service drop. Those are all fixed costs that do not vary based on consumption. And so you try to, or attempt to recover those through this fixed monthly customer charge. Now, when you don't, you're going to recover that cost, but it's going to be buried in the energy rate. When you do that, there's issues that can occur, and it's a fairness issue. The first one may or may not be of concern. It is in different utilities more so than others. When you have seasonal customers and you have a customer charge that's lower than it should be, what happens is your seasonal customers are getting a break at the expense of your year-round ratepayers. I mean, I'm from Michigan, and I'm sorry, but if somebody can afford to spend the winters in Florida, they can pay what they're supposed to pay for electric service in Michigan.
Yeah.
And so we have to endure the year-round winters, and we end up giving a subsidy to seasonal customers. That's number one. The second item is and this is probably going to surprise you, but it's low income. It tends to be unfair to low income if that customer charge is too low. because low-income customers tend to be higher than average electric consumers. And when you think about it, it depends on the demographics in the area, but most utilities, low income is higher than average. And the reason is they cannot afford to purchase a home that's been built in the last 20 years.
It's more energy efficient.
Correct. They're buying older homes that don't have the proper insulation around the windows, doors. They can't afford to purchase the energy efficient appliances, so their average consumption tends to be higher. Now, there are certain regions where low income is actually slightly lower, and that's in areas where you have a lot of newer rental units. All right. So there's actually a third reason, which is becoming huge in our industry, is with the installation of solar. And I don't know, I didn't ask if that's been an issue here or not, but I do work like in California, Roseville, California, for example. 10% of the residential customers have installed solar. Imperial Irrigation District, I just finished a study there, and they're upwards of about 5% of their customers have installed solar, and it just keeps growing and growing. Well, what happens when a customer installs solar on your normal rate schedules, let's say that you charge 10 cents a kilowatt hour. For any, so they take 1,000 kilowatt hours off of your system, but give you back 600. You can only bill them for 400 units, which on the surface sounds correct. The problem with it is they're using 1,000 kilowatt hours off of your distribution system and creating those peak demands, which is driving the sizing of your transformers. Yet you're not recovering it in the rate, the way it's being charged. So there's different ways that utilities have been approaching to try to correct it. And this is a problem in our rate structures that go back 100 years, and we're trying to correct it now because of all these things that are occurring. But one of the ways to help correct it is to move that customer charge to the levels that it should be. And that's usually the first step. And, you know, when you think about it, and I don't even know, maybe I shouldn't just talk about this, but when you think about our structures in our industry, our rate structures for residential, we're sending price signals to install solar, which from a conservation standpoint is good, from an environmental standpoint is good, but the problem is we're not sending them the proper price signals. And if they're relying on it, the costs justify the installation of solar. And then 3, 4, 5 years go by, and we say we got to correct it because all our other rates are going up. Now all of a sudden the economics to install it may no longer be there.
Yeah.
And so we're not doing them any favor. The only ones we're doing a favor to are the companies that are installing solar. And do you know something else? 75% of that subsidy that we're giving solar customers goes to the solar installation companies, not to the residential homeowners. 75% of it. So, and your ratepayers are paying for that. And there's other ways, if you wanted to be environmental, that you can do it in a more economical way than the installation of solar at the customer's site. You know, you can install your own solar and have people buy into it. There's other different things. Because you believe me, I work with a lot of councils that are very environmentally conscious, and they want us to conserve, and they want to make sure that that happens. And you know, and there's different things that can be done to do that and accomplish it, but still recover our cost. All right, now this is your financial projection with $60 million in debt and $6.28 million in capacity payments. And what this is a 5-year projection, and this first scenario has no rate increase in it. And remember the debt coverage ratio, where our minimum target is 1.4? Without a rate adjustment and the issuance of $60 million in debt, our current coverage in 2015 is projected at 2.59, but in 2016 it goes to 1.27. All right. The cash reserves, your minimum level is about 10, 11 million. You're actually, even without a rate adjustment, above it, right? Your operating income, this is where the main issue is. It's the utility basis transition. Your target operating income is about 3 million, but we're projected to be at 757,000, quite a bit below. At the end in 2019, this is because like in 2017, you get this full 6.3 million in capacity payments kicking in. That's why you see these changes occurring. But the target operating income is 4.3 million, and your adjusted operating income is 2.6. And again, that's with no rate adjustments. So, I mean, if you were to look at this, you could say, okay, we're not far off. The problem is if you continue on this path and you're to extend this out to 2020, 2021, 22, what it's going to show is a need for a large increase, because it's going to start affecting your cash. So in order to hit our targets, actually we end up hitting it by about 2018, is about a 1.7% increase, a relatively modest rate adjustment over the next 5 years will keep the utility financially stable. Believe me, you'll get a better bond rating from it too, and lower interest costs. But you can see debt coverage ratio is not an issue at all. You stay above, you got 1.39 here, but you're real close to the 1.4. Cash reserves are healthy, they're above the minimum, and you're achieving your target operating income with relatively modest rate changes. I mean, like I said, you're a financially stable utility, and it's so easy to keep you there. Right? Now, if you did not issue or construct the new generating units and didn't issue any debt, but you were able to maintain the $3 million in capacity payments, you could go the entire 5 years without any rate adjustments and actually be pretty close to your adjusted operating income target. The big question with this is whether or not you'd be able to maintain that $3 million in capacity payments. And, you know, because I work a lot around the country and I'm looking, you know, some of the trends in our industry, it's not even trends, it's what's happening. It's because there's so many closures of small coal-fired plants, generation capacity value, because it keeps going up.
Oh, it's going up?
It's going up.
How's it going up if you're closing plants?
Because there's no capacity. In other words, you know, when you look back 2 years ago, in the marketplace for electric, didn't even put much of a value at all on capacity.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2016, it's up to around $4 or $5 per kW now in different parts of the country, which is substantial, and it's expected to continue to rise.
Okay.
Now, Coffeyville, and there's other reasons too that you may want to think about it when it comes to these generating units, and that's reliable service to your customers. You know, the utility I work for, Holland, Michigan, we had the philosophy we wanted to make sure that we had enough generation capacity, that if something happened to that transmission line, that we could provide our customers with electricity. Now, a number of other utilities, of course, take that philosophy. It sounds like it's a philosophy here. And one of the things that I've noticed in the utilities I've worked for is utilities that take that approach, they don't have the lowest electric rates in the state, but they all tend to be less than the average. And the reason is because they have more stable power supply costs. So like you go back to 2008, at that point in time, on-peak electric rates were about twice as what they are today, all right? Because of the demands on the system, the price of natural gas. And so, and then it dropped in 2009. Well, utilities that were exposed to that market, and a lot of utilities I work for were. What happened is in 2008, their rates were really high. Right now, their rates are low. In 2008, they were really high. So they had that volatility in their rates. Well, your customers are going to experience more stable rates by having that generation and getting that capacity payment. and also more reliable electric service because you're not totally exposed to that transmission line. So for a relatively modest investment in a sense, I'm not a salesman of generating units, believe me, but, you know, that's something that you probably want to think about is for 1.77%, you can construct that unit. Now, if you lost that capacity payment, that $3 million, this is what would occur. So now all of a sudden your rates are going to go up because that $3 million is a substantial amount of money. And so the rate track would end up, instead of being 1.77, would almost double. Actually over double. It's almost 4%, 3.9% annually over 5 years.
Well, we've committed to scenario one, so, I mean,
Yeah,
I
we've
appreciate
got
all these numbers, but we're,
Our contract
These
with
are-
GRDA is
42,
45,
Okay.
2042.
2042.
yeah, we've committed to, we're
Okay.
gonna do the new generation, and
Okay, good.
it's interesting to see this information now.
So I guess the direction, what I'd like to do is to go through and design rates. Now, you can see by looking at this that it's not like we have to quickly get rates in place by January 1. You know, it's more a matter of let's get the rates right. Let's do the corrections and move them slowly. And whether it's, the only thing that I would recommend is don't put the rate increase in place if you agree with it, July 1. You know, you want to do it either in the spring or in the fall. And usually I recommend utilities do it in the fall. And the reason for that is because customers' usage tends to be higher in the summer, starts to fall off, you adjust rates. It's not that noticeable. Not that I'm trying to disguise it, I just don't want to create, again, rate shock. I don't want to increase rates at the peak usage time.
Right.
Then they attribute, they read in the paper that rates increase, and they look at their bill and they think all that increase
It was our
is
fault.
from, yeah, it's really because their usage went up.
Those assholes.
So,
I can't wait to vote them out of office.
So my first question is this. For next year, would you agree that we can, to move forward, to design rates with a modest 1.77% rate adjustment? I mean, is that something that you'd be open to?
I would say I'm open to that. When's the last time we raised our rate, our electric rate?
2002.
Wow.
It's been a long time. It's amazing it looks as good.
Well, it's the PCA.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
It could have been too. You're overcharging in 2002 because you're using
No.
the cash basis. Let's not talk about that, right?
Some of us
Well,
were
it's
here in
PCA.
2002. Shh.
Yeah.
And the capacity payments.
Those
roll
other
into
guys.
it.
Oh, okay. The capacity payments.
Actually,
Wait a second.
I voted against that electric rate increase, actually.
So, I mean, you have any?
That's, is that reasonable?
Well, let me, I did do,
I'm not
what
gonna commit
did
to
I say,
anything right
$1.60
right
a
this
month, I
second.
think it was? On a typical residential ratepayer, on average, it would equate to about $1.60 a month. Their average bill's around $90, I think. So it's not even the price of Starbucks coffee, maybe a small.
It beats sitting in the dark.
I mean, if
I
we,
I think the answer is yes, but we want to see what it actually looks like.
oh, absolutely. You know, what I do is, because this goes to the second piece, absolutely. I mean, I'm not asking for approval, just some guidance so that I can go back and start. What makes it hard is I don't want to go and design rates based on my perceptions, and then to come back to you and say, that's not what we want. And it's kind of, I don't think that's good. It's not good for me. I don't like to do things that aren't approved. It's not, I don't think it's good, you know, I think it's important to get your input prior to that.
I think one of the interesting points that you mentioned up front, that probably need to work pretty close with the staff, city staff on with the electric department. It's when you talked about eliminating some of the tiers within that rate structure.
Yeah. Yeah, and what we do, what you're going to see when we do the rate design is we model the impacts at different usage levels, because we don't want to say that we're increasing rates by 1.77%, and then all of a sudden have somebody get a 20% increase because we restructured the rates. So we look at it over a series of usages. Not that we want to model every single one of your customers' usage, but we want to get most of your customers within that graph, so to speak. So that we don't create any kind of rate shock where you think you increase rates by $1.60, and some are going to see $2 and some are going to see $1.20 or whatever. But all of a sudden somebody calls and my bill went up by $20 a month. It's not good for anybody. So we model that over various usages, so you can make the decision. But the other part of it is that if you did go along with the 1.77, how much leeway you'll allow me to move some of these classes closer to cost of service. And I was thinking about this. What I would recommend is to have a bandwidth, in a sense, of 0 to 3, where no class would see an increase greater than 3%. Some may see 0, quite likely your large power might see a 0. Residential is going to be pretty close to the average, maybe slightly below. Your general large peak off, they would probably see close to 3%. Some of these others would too. Well, some we can't do anything about, like the KCC, but not unless you go to the Public Service Commission. But if that's a reasonable bandwidth to approach the rate design. I do want to mention one other thing that we're looking at doing, and that is to do an economic development rate to try to promote economic growth. And when we develop an economic development rate, we do not want it to result in other customers' rates going up because of it. So what we do is we look at the contribution margin, the fixed cost contribution that we would receive in our rates from that customer. So let's say that 20% of the rate is for fixed cost recovery. Then we can give them upwards of a 20% rate increase without causing a rate decrease, without causing an impact on our existing customers. Now, we can do that because we have fixed infrastructure costs. For example, we have a transformer, and there's adequate capacity in that transformer to handle that load. Now, as time goes on, and the system grows, continues to grow, eventually that transformer is going to have to be added to, of which that customer would be partly responsible. So when you develop economic development rates, they typically have a sunset period, usually 3 or 5 years. So I kind of want to give you a heads up on that too, that we're going to be looking at economic development rates. Is that 0 to 3% sound reasonable to work within that range? Right.
That sounds fine to me.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I'd be willing to look at it and see how it pans out, but
Yeah.
sure.
And I believe, Mark, that's what you're going to design the rates with. If the
Yeah.
commission gives a consensus,
Yeah.
we'll design it with that 3% bandwidth.
Yeah.
And come back to the commission at that time. We'll have the new rate design. We'll have the customer charge recommendations, which he's recommended that we increase slightly, and then the economic development rate as well.
And this is the other thing, and what I would have you think about is you're at $4.59, and the customer charge should be $18.05. And I'd probably recommend that you increase this by about $1.50. Now, by increasing this by $1.50, what that means, remember I said the average residential rate's going to go up by about $1.60 as a result of this? The energy rate's probably gonna remain the same, or if there's an increase, it'd be very slight. All the increase is gonna go into the customer charge, or most of it.
The $1.60 that you speak of, that is along with the 1.77.
No, that would be included. That'd be all in, an all-in rate increase.
Okay.
So
The second, and I have a couple questions. The 1.77 increase is an increase consistently over the next 4
5
years.
Yeah, 5 years, yeah.
Okay, and that brings us to a total rate increase over the next 5 years of, where are we at, 9.2%?
Something like that. Be around there. Was it?
Pardon?
I think it was quite that.
It's a 9.2 through 2015 through 2019,
Yeah.
but it's spread out until the 11.8.
Yeah. The 11.8 is a little bit, just so you know, the cost of service study is a snapshot. There's a lot of things happening in your financial projection. So even though right now it says 11.2, when you bring in all the capacity payments, you bring in the changes, it actually ended up, you only needed about, what does that calculate, a little over 9% over that period of time. Plus there's compounding and other things that's relatively small.
The second question I had is, we haven't read, and this is probably for you, and we haven't raised our rate increases since 2002. And if we do absolutely nothing, what happens?
If you did nothing,
Is that one of the scenarios?
this is the scenario that was projected to occur. Over 5 years, you would still be above your minimum reserve levels. Your coverage ratio, you'd be really tight on your coverage ratio in 2016. You'd be below on your adjusted operating income. Now, if you were to extend this out, because at this point in time, once all those once the $6 million of capacity payments come in, now you're in a cash burn situation. See, your cash is dropping each year. If you extend this out, you're going to start falling below your minimum. Now you're going to have to reverse that cash burn and bring it back above the minimum, which is going to mean you're going to end up with a substantial increase probably around 2021.
So,
if you did
to boil
nothing.
down what you're saying is, it's either small incremental increases now, or something significant all of a sudden in 5 or
2021.
6 years.
Correct. That's correct.
And in all sincerity, what should have been happening since 2002 was very small incremental increases each year, and we wouldn't even be to the point where we have to have a 1.77 now.
Even at
Isn't
one
that
point,
true?
I'll tell you what,
If we just done
maybe-
0.25% each year over the last.
yeah, but I don't know if you'd want to increase rates 0.25% a year. I mean, that's probably too small. You know, 1.77, you know, I did try a number of scenarios, see, okay, should we go every other year? Because, like I said, something less than 5% a year is going to be acceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, if you looked at me and said, hey, why don't we just combine these, and let's do 5% in 2016 and 4% in 2019. I'd probably say, you know what, we're going to be okay, and that'll work. But you might get some people in some industries complaining.
Sure.
And so the 1.77 is so small that, you know, it's customers are going to be able to adjust and incorporate it into their budgets without causing virtually any grief at all. The only problem is that as a commission you might want to think about is when we do this, it means that every year we're going to have a rate adjustment. Now, there are ways to get around that, and that would be to approve at one meeting or one time 3 years worth of rates. Because I don't think you want to see me here every year or, you know, stand before you to increase rates. So it may be something that you may want to think about is do 3 years worth of rates. Approve them at once, put them in place, put them in the ordinance. And so on October 1st of 2015,
Just
these
kicks
other
in.
rates, October 1st, 2016, and so on. And we could do that too. We do that a lot, actually. We didn't quote the other 2 years of rate designs, but it's not that much more.
But the bottom line is, the rates have to go up between now and 2020.
Correct.
And it's just a matter of, do we eat the elephant in 2 bites? Do we eat it in a lot of small bites, or do we eat it all at once?
Correct. That's really what it boils down
Because
to.
if we don't eat the elephant, then what happens is, the
elephant
elephant's
eats
going to
us.
eat us,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
we're behind the 8 ball, and then we're in really big trouble, because we won't have cash reserves to cover what we need to have covered.
I'll tell you another reason, Wayne, to do the annual increases. You have a lot of issues with your rate structures.
Yeah,
The more often we change the rates, the more opportunities you have to fix it in small bites. You know, to start eliminating those rate blocks, to start moving that customer charge up to levels it should. We can do it very gradually with small adjustments. Where if I did do 5% and subsequently 4%, that's only 2 adjustments. Now with the 5% plus the bandwidth, now I'm talking between 3 and 7%.
yeah,
So now I'm starting to get into significant numbers.
yeah.
So
So in 2020, with, at 1.77, in 2020, are you saying, am I putting words in your mouth, saying that we would be able then to reduce that 1.77 to something less?
obviously, it just depends on the projection. I mean, just looking at it, you're probably going to not have to adjust rates for a couple of years after that. That'd be my guess. But the thing is, one of the things I want to caution you about, and I shouldn't have even said what I just said. When I do a projection like this, 5-year projection, there's only one thing I'm certain of. I'm going to be wrong. All right. You know, this is based on so many assumptions and growth and increased inflation and that, you know, but when I look out almost always 2 or 3 years, I'm really close. That 4th or 5th year, there's too many things that can happen. So it's good to have this projection updated. What I recommend utilities do is, you know, a cost of service study like what we did, the other part of it is important, but it only has to be done every 3 to 5 years. This, however, needs to be dynamic. It needs to be done every year, because, you know, when you start getting, like I said, I'm pretty comfortable out 2, 3 years. I'm not so comfortable out 5.
Yeah,
But when I go next year, I go to do the budget. Now all of a sudden that becomes a clearer picture, and so these should be updated annually, the financial projections.
well, I was on the commission when we implemented the PCA, and we did it because we weren't doing that. And we got to a point where we realized, holy cow, we're basically paying people to take our electricity. We can't keep doing this, and it was at a time when natural gas, just the cost of it went up like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, and if we didn't implement the PCA, we were looking at just almost catastrophic increases in the utility rates. So,
So we'll come back with 1 year unless you want to see 3 years, or if you do, we can talk about that.
I just say take it in small bites.
Yeah. Small
see.
bites are better.
We'll see what it looks like and make a decision at that point.
I'll agree with that. I still think that we're paying for the sins of people from the past for not addressing it when it should have been addressed.
Oh, that.
And now the bucket's been dropped on us.
And the same with the wastewater, and the same with
Yeah.
the water, and yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
You're
I
right.
am.
But with this approach going forward, we're gonna start setting money back for depreciation, which is what we should have been doing for the last 30 years.
Well, which translates into the people that are using the stuff now are going to be the people who are going to pay to replace it.
Right.
And that's the fair way to do it.
Exactly.
And this approach, this utility basis approach, these targets, your other utilities can use them too.
Sure.
The water, wastewater, it works for all the utilities. So.
I'd like to see the final scenario, final draft of
Yeah.
unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, and like you said, by not doing this and setting money back in the past, when we should have been, you've got people now gonna pay to replace it, but the people now are 10,000 versus they were significantly
12.5
higher.
then, yeah.
It was significantly higher back then.
And also, when you looked at the budget of the electric department, the expenses, from like 13 and 14, and you can see where it was drastically cut for 2015, you had a question or an issue about that, didn't you?
In 2015, I know that, and I think you probably helped me out with this, I know that we did our initial projections, and which was based on historical numbers, and we did incorporate some aspects of your budget into it. And then I know that Mike worked with you, and we did modify some things with 2015 as a result of some changes, I think, in personnel, in the personnel budget.
That's in the personnel budget for
Yeah.
2015.
Yeah.
But you didn't automatically take the 2015 number because I believe you and Mike both thought that was unrealistically low, is what the budget.
The bottom line was the budget that was presented, you didn't think that they can operate with that budget. And that had 5 staff positions eliminated. So this projection, this recommendation is based on restoring those 5 positions.
It is. I do want to just add, if I can add a little bit into that. One of the things I don't do with these projections, it is not based on your budget, based on our projections. The reason I do that is based on our experience. I'm not saying this is specific to Coffeyville or anything, but based on our experience and my own experience working with my own municipal, budgets tend to be about 12 to 15% higher than what is actually spent. So we don't want the rates to be artificially inflated due to that. So we project it, but then if there's any new programs, we'll bring those in individually. So in your case, we did do the projection, but we did roll in some additional expenditures for those positions also, if I remember correctly. So I kind of want to give you a little, these projections are really ours.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think I'm set with and got the feedback I need. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I appreciate you
Very
taking the
thorough
time.
presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
And I apologize for being late. Thank you for
Oh,
your
no.
patience.
So,
All right,
thanks.
thank you. Any other questions then?
I don't have any.
All right. Well, then, we'll adjourn to a short executive session to discuss confidential data relating to financial affairs or trade secrets of second parties.
Second, aye.
30 minutes. So,
Yeah,
Thank
but
you.
Chris and I are in there, so it just
yeah,
might.
30 minutes.
Okay, till 7.
I have a lot of questions.